Today on Inside Medical Malpractice, we're going to shine a light on some of the events that have greatly challenged long-term care facilities in Canada in the past years. We're going to focus on some specific events in Ontario, but I think it's fair to say that some of the problems are systemic. Across the country, perhaps across North America, it's a tough subject that will include some graphic details and stories today. So if you have little ones nearby or someone listening who might be greatly upset by this subject, you might want to stick on your headphones or distance yourself a little bit for the first few minutes of the podcast as we get started. I'm going to start by talking about Elizabeth Wetloffer, a convicted serial killer in Ontario and former registered nurse who confessed to murdering 8 senior citizens in long-term care facilities and attempting to murder 6 others between 2007 and 2016. Her method was to inject lethal doses of insulin, and that, for those of you who may not know, results in severely low blood sugar, which can cause brain damage and death. Her victims were all between the ages of 75 and 96. What's concerning is Elizabeth Wetloffer started her nursing career in 2007, and when she commenced her last work at the nursing home in 2014, she had glowing references. She was well-liked. They said she was a good worker who loved to mentor and teach. But her employment history prior to that time had been rocky, to say the least. She struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism. She had faced accusation of showing up to work drunk, and at one point found passed out in a facility basement. She was suspended 4 times for medication-related errors. And then she was finally fired in 2014 over a serious incident during which she gave some wrong medication to a patient. The evidence in the inquiry of the Wetloffer cases at the end of the day concluded, in part, that future tragedies in long-term care setting simply could not continue if we continue to do the same things in the same ways. Less than a year later, however, the headlines in Ontario read that a public inquiry was urgently required in long-term care due to multiple deaths by the coronavirus spread through hundreds of long-term care facilities. We won't recount all of those details. They're still very much in the news. We've done a podcast on some of the issues in long-term care facilities. But what I found really interesting when I read through some of the reports and investigations into both the Wetloffer case and the COVID pandemic recommendation was that even though the events that sparked those 2 investigations was markedly different, one had the specific goal to deter healthcare serial killers, and the other to assess the long-term care crisis, to provide immediate personnel, to relieve death, provide humanitarian relief. The hoped-for outcomes of both of those inquiries was to prevent injury and death in the long-term care setting. Also interesting was that many of the recommendations made in the 2019 report after the Wetloffer investigations were re-identified as still being problematic in the 2020 report by the Canadian Augmented Civilian Care Teams who investigated the long-term care pandemic in Ontario. Identified were careful analysis of previous incidents, inadequate staffing, and in some cases, failure to follow some very basic procedures. Despite the similarities and the differences in those 2 incidents and those 2 investigations, I think what we all understand now is that a light has been shone on a part of our healthcare system that requires greater attention and additional resources. As of today, which is January 29th, 2021, there are multiple large class actions that have been launched against long-term care due to the COVID-19 action. In Ontario alone, there have been nearly 3,500 deaths of residents and long-term care frontline staff, and there are currently more than 200 care facilities in outbreak. For those of you who listened to a conversation I had with Gary Will in April of 2020, I have an aunt in a long-term care facility, and on that particular date, her facility had just had their first outbreak, which was really frightening. And now, 8 months later, they've had a second outbreak, and she has just tested positive for COVID and is not doing well. And it's concerning for as much as we know and as carefully locked down as long-term supposedly is, that the outbreaks are continuing and mortality and morbidity continues as well. And the thing is, we're still deep in it. I mean, no one could even tell you with any degree of certainty how this is going to all play out. At the same time as these actions are being started, there are moves towards governments blocking legal action against long-term care facilities because they are, and of course continue to be, an essential service in the time of a crisis. In light of these events, healthcare professionals, lawyers, residents of nursing homes, and the public all have a vested interest in this highly important topic. So today we're going to once again speak about the long-term care system in Ontario and whether the struggles that we're seeing due to this COVID-19 pandemic are due to the pandemic or the result of a long-standing problem tied to funding cuts, increased privatization. Some would say government neglect, some would say general indifference. I find it kind of interesting also that when you read a little bit about the history of long-term care in Canada, it's not that old of a system. It's just was kind of fresh in the 70s and 80s and has grown over the last 30 years, and grown quickly thanks to the baby boomer crisis, but not necessarily grown in a way that we would all like to see it. So let's talk about this issue today a little bit more. Today, I'm just thrilled to welcome back Farah Ismail. For those of you who listen to this podcast, she was a guest last year, and we talked about how nurses could keep themselves or prevent themselves from being involved in a lawsuit during the pandemic crisis. She was a fabulous guest. One of her podcasts is still the most popular, highest numbered download that we have. And I'm so excited to welcome her back today in this issue called Shining a Light on Long-Term Care. Let me just remind you first a little bit about this amazing person. Farah Ismail, after several years of nursing regulation at the College of Nurses of Ontario and several years of working in both nursing and the law, now has a deep knowledge and understanding of the impact on our healthcare system and understands the critical need to provide safe, accessible, and adequate services, both from a medical and legal perspective. She's the founder and principal of Intersect Consulting and the Quality and Compliance Officer for the Southeast Health in Ontario. She's an advocate. She's a builder of strong teams. She's an excellent speaker. She's so articulate and well-versed. Farah's beginnings were as a nurse. She holds a BSc and a Master of Science in Nursing from the University of Western Ontario, her law degree from the University of Windsor. She's a thought leader. She has a passion for health promotion. She's one of a very select group who's attained fellowship in regulatory excellence from the National Council of State Boards of Nursing. She's a published author. She's a speaker, and her most recent research was referenced by experts in the 2018-2019 public inquiry into the safety and security of residents in the long-term care home system. She recently held the position of executive board member for the inaugural Nurse Health Program in Ontario. She's co-founded a charity called Grayson's Gratitude, a fundraiser that supports kidney research in the Toronto Sick Kids Foundation. Her first podcast, which focused on avoiding malpractice, as I said, remains one of the most popular podcasts. And I was just telling Farah, she's the first guest I've ever had back twice on this podcast to date. So I am thrilled that she's here. Just one quick disclosure before I start speaking to her is to everyone listening today, note that the information presented is general information only. It's not meant to be legal advice. If you do require legal assistance, please contact a lawyer. The information we present today, of course, can become outdated as laws change, information changes, policies change within your facility or wherever you happen to work. So with all that said, welcome back, Farah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Chris, for such a warm welcome. It's been a while since we've last chatted, and it's such a pleasure to be back here again speaking with you about this really important topic. So, I think we're all aware that this global pandemic has really, really inflicted tremendous tragedy on our long-term care homes in Ontario. And we really need to be able to explore and get to the bottom of why this has occurred. And I think that just given your preliminary comments, I really do believe that our discussion can sort of be categorized into three buckets. So I would say, the first is really about the long-term care system and, why there's been such a tragic impact. I think the second is about the province of Ontario itself and where gaps and barriers exist that may have potentially led to these tragedies. And then I think the third piece of it is really about healthcare professionals who are currently working in this sector and what they need to be mindful of.
Perfect. Well, that's a great way to lay it out. So why don't we start at the beginning with the system itself?
Okay, sure. So I think, the long-term care system, it's really been designed, obviously, to care for the most elderly in our population. We know that these individuals are entering the end of their life cycle. They require a lot of supportive care. They may suffer from illnesses, have limited mobility, or neurological or degenerative diseases that make communication and really self-advocacy difficult for them. I found it interesting just in my preparation for our podcast today. I looked at the Ontario Long-Term Care Association website and their description of what a resident profile looks like in this sector. I thought it'd be important to sort of just highlight this for the group today. 90% of them have some form of cognitive impairment. 86% need extensive help with their activities of daily living. 80% have neurological diseases, 76 have heart and circulation diseases, 64% have a diagnosis of dementia, 62% have musculoskeletal diseases, 61% take more than 10 prescription medications, 40% need monitoring for acute medical conditions, and 21% have experienced a stroke. So as you can see, these are complex individuals who are residing in these facilities. And so to further add to their complexities, adult children who are usually responsible for their parents' care often have competing responsibilities where they need to balance the care of their own children with that of their own parents. So long-term care homes, are just sort of the most difficult place for many because of the resident demographic and then the individuals who need to advocate for them on their behalf. So in Ontario, long-term care homes are licensed and regulated. They receive funding from our provincial government for nursing, personal care programs, services, and food. And long-term care homes, I think, as you astutely pointed out, are a mix of municipal homes, primarily privately owned homes, and not-for-profits. So the other thing I think that's critical to point out is over the next 20 years, as we all know, with the aging population, it's anticipated that there will be more than twice as many seniors over the age of 75, and by extension, the growth in the number who need long-term care support. So the crisis in Ontario, long-term care, it's been developing slowly. Our providers know about it, government officials are aware, public health experts have struggled to address various threats. And these threats really include things like staffing shortages, PPE shortages, inadequate infection control and prevention measures, the inability to meet patient needs and care for them, poor communication with stakeholders such as residents and their families. And this is why I think, compounded with the current pandemic, that there's heightened awareness and also resulting legal actions and complaints. So, I know that extraordinary measures have recently been taken. I think you mentioned this a little bit before, where the Canadian Armed Forces have entered these areas, which is really unique to begin with, having military involved in the care of our most vulnerable. And, what has been noted and what was released with some of these reports were the allegations were ranging from substandard care to poor infection control procedures and outright abuse of patients. So I think despite all of the efforts that have been directed, we know COVID-19 has been taking a devastating toll on our Ontario healthcare, on our Ontario long-term care homes. So with both end staff demonstrating high rates of infection, and this just continues to occur through our second wave.
It does. And as I mentioned, like I said, my aunt who's in a long-term care center, not in Ontario, she's in a lockdown unit. She's been vaccinated, has received the first vaccine 3 weeks ago. and still ended up testing positive. And it's just such a challenge. So listen, I mean, the public inquiry has been conducted recently, and I'm sure there's many more to come, but what else could the province or can the province do to address the issues that currently exist within the system?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, the province does have accountability for the oversight of these long-term care homes. The global pandemic has inflicted, again, this tremendous tragedy on our system and has really shone the light on an already taxed system, which has, outdated infrastructure, lack of adequate staff. That's a critical one. Less pay for these professionals, and I think overall some disorganization. So the Ontario government has committed to making the decision to step up with this independent commission they've put together to examine the devastating impact. But there is some criticism around this where, critics have said that the approach may fall short of a full-scale public inquiry, which might be more useful. And I think, part of the reason that a commission has launched is because they want to investigate and report on the cases of the spread of COVID-19 in our province's long-term care homes. And this final report is really set to be delivered at the end of April of this year. So, I think part of the reasoning for doing it as a commission is really that it's a nonpartisan way to conduct a thorough and expedited review, since the last inquiry took almost 2 years to release the final report. So I think, there's some attention to the critical need and the speed at which this needs to occur, which is why it's going to be via commission as opposed to public inquiry. So already we do have some interim recommendations that have been made as of December of 2020, and they really focus on effective leadership and accountability, the use of performance indicators to assess each home's readiness to prevent and manage COVID-19 outbreaks, and some focused inspections to assess compliance with the measures to reduce the impact of the virus. And, just to say, Chris, I'm very sorry to hear about your aunt. I think, my heart goes out to you. It's such a difficult time for so many who are trying to care for their loved ones in such a difficult environment. So, I really hope that things go well for her, and I hope that she does overcome this case of COVID. The other thing I wanted to mention was I did read a recent article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which I thought was really, really insightful. And, the article compared deaths in long-term care in Ontario versus that of British Columbia. And there were some really interesting responses. And I think it's important to sort of compare. I know we're all, we're national, we're Canadian, but our provinces really have addressed the long-term issue slightly differently. And so I thought I might point it out. So in BC, they fared better than those in Ontario. And some of the reasons that were noted in this article are around clearer communication by government officials, staffing limitations to single homes, so to prevent, that spread of COVID. Health teams were sent out to assist with all aspects of infection. And then PPE and testing, they look different. And then in early March, the threshold for an outbreak, so last March, was revised to one single case, as opposed to, I think I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think it's like 2 or more or something like that, which exists in Ontario. So there are also several baseline differences that exist, which led to better COVID-19 outcomes in BC versus that of Ontario. And that those things were examples of better coordination, long-term care hospitals and public health being involved together, which occurred in BC earlier than it did in Ontario.
Well, thanks for highlighting those differences. I think we're all aware that every city, every health region, every province, every country even, down to a very granular level, are managing this crisis differently. And I think it's going to be fascinating at the end of the day. It might be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, I'm not sure, but to look back on this and really incorporate what worked and what didn't work in a pandemic plan for the future, because I've talked to a lot of doctors in the last few weeks about this. My business is all medical legal work, and we have hundreds of doctors and nurses working with us. And nobody thinks it's over, and nobody thinks that this will be the last pandemic that we see, even in our lifetime, right? I mean, I was
very scary.
yeah, yeah. So hopefully we all have the opportunity to learn from each other, just to comparing what worked in BC and versus what worked in Ontario. So, so as this all plays out, and it's taking a seemingly never-ending course, but as it all plays out, I'm assuming, as we've already seen, that the families of deceased residents will continue to seek answers and call for accountability. And this often, as we all know, happens through the court system, through medical malpractice, to class actions. What are your thoughts around what we might expect in the coming months?
Well, I think there's a few things here. And before I even launch into sort of the class actions piece of it, or the litigation that might come around it, I do believe that there's probably going to be a push for home care. Like, I think that, from my own perspective, with parents who are aging, or, knock on wood, quite healthy, but aging, I really, really think about whether I want them in, to place them in a home, if that in fact becomes something they need. So really, the safety around home care and being able to manage the care part of, and in the know about, I think would probably be one of the first things we start to see. I think also in terms of class actions, we'll probably see more coming around, as we've already observed. These may be on the rise again because of what's being uncovered. So I think the second wave of this pandemic is probably going to continue to highlight some of the difficulties in this sector. And I think, typically the claims will probably relate to failing to protect residents due to inadequate measures being in a place, such as appropriate number of staff, the proper training, supervision of employees for visitors, appropriate visitation policies, communication with families, and then again, just like the adequate PPE and appropriate record keeping. So it will be very interesting to see if these claims will be successful. It's kind of a wait and see approach. And I think in the interim, I think healthcare professionals who work in the sector have to be vigilant when it comes to their practices. In particular, I think they have to raise concern and awareness when policies and procedures aren't in existence, or if anything is unclear. That is your obligation as a healthcare professional. A regulated healthcare professional should be doing that. And I think seeking the support, from regulatory bodies, professional associations. There's lots of resource out there. This is a hot topic. People are talking about it. Just seeking out the support where you can find it. And I think professionals also, they need to be aware of the standards of practice that they're going to be held accountable for. Those standards of practice don't change. We have medication administration, documentation. It doesn't matter what the context, regulated health professionals will be held to account to those standards. And I think most recently, professionals working in long-term care are required to undergo right now surveillance testing. They're being encouraged to get vaccinated if they have the opportunity. And I would really suggest that professionals have an obligation to engage in what's being offered to them to help keep their patients and themselves safe. On the other side of things, I think long-term care homes should be thinking about policies and procedures which reflect best practices. I think specifically about staffing, infection control, and communication. Those would be the top three. And then I think to ensure that all of the statutory requirements are being met. So those could be changing, they could be evolving, being in the know and really keeping apprised of those things. And then again, maintaining standards related to those things like documentation, infection prevention and control, personal health information. Those would all be really, really important.
Could I stop you there just for a moment, Farah? When you talk about ensuring that statutory requirements are met, what are you talking about there?
Well, to ensure that you have the proper complement of staff, right? And that your staffing numbers relate to the number of patients that you have in your setting.
Mm,
Oftentimes I think what we hear from healthcare professionals is, there weren't enough of us available, or
mm,
the workload was really, really high. And those are all very, very fair comments. It's a busy, busy area of practice. So, as a long-term care provider, I think it's your requirement to make sure that you're able to staff appropriately, and when you're not, that you're doing everything in your power to figure out how you can to help
mm.
patients and your staff safe.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Um,
I liked your little slip there when you said long-term hair, because we were just
I know we were talking
we
about
were just talking before we started about how long it's been since either of us have had a haircut. We're like, oh man. Oh God. So sorry for that little aside, but it's good to laugh every once in a while, isn't it? This is a tough subject. Okay, so carry on, Farah.
And I think coming back to, the communication with family members, keeping them apprised of what's happening with regular frequency. I think we've seen lots of information in the media from families who haven't felt that communication has been stellar, right? So how can you, as a long-term care provider, make sure that that happens? And I think, there's ways around it, ensuring you have the appropriate consents to speak to people who are responsible and accountable for their parents' care or their grandparents' care, and then doing it with some sort of frequency, so that people feel like they're in the know when they're not able to be present with their loved ones. And then, something else I just thought I'd raise here, and I think you sort of alluded to it in your intro, but it's about this good faith immunity from COVID lawsuits that's, sort of coming out. The move would really protect organizations and people, including healthcare providers, from lawsuits if they spread COVID-19 while acting in good faith. So really, I think what that captures is if you are following the protocols, you are doing everything correctly, you are staffing, you are communicating, you're in, providing PPE, all of those good infection prevention and control measures are in place. And then there still is the spread of COVID. We know it exists. It's an unknown, and it's going to happen. So I think, there's some value to that good faith immunity provision, but also as an owner, as somebody who is providing care, you have to know what you need to do in order to be able to use that sort of provision if and when it comes into play.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because certainly when we talked to the lawyer in Ontario, Gary Will, who's managing one of the class actions, he was very specific in stating that the action would be against individual care providers. It's very much, because everybody in the moment is doing the best they can with the information that they have. And certainly my heart and gratitude go out to anybody who's been facing that on the front line right now. But the issues are with exactly what you described: the long-term care facilities themselves, the policies, procedures, the measures, the staffing, the equipment that people had. And, we've seen and heard all kinds of stories, even though, and I think, to be fair, what hits the news is the bad news. And we know that lots of great work is going on, and lots of people in long-term care don't have COVID, and lots of healthcare providers don't. But I mean, this is something that will not be ignored in the future. It's been its own tragedy.
Absolutely.
So you've talked a little bit about healthcare providers and facilities. What about families? Because, it's just really been challenging to not even be able to visit loved ones in a long-term care facility. And the communication, as you said, which was kind of stellar in the beginning when everyone was like, oh, let's rally around this and let's talk and let's support each other. Over the last several months, I think for many people, the communication has dropped off significantly, probably just by, a level of fatigue by the entire world.
Right.
We can't talk about this forever, but it's a very helpless feeling being on the outside and having someone in a long-term care facility. What can families specifically do to protect their loved ones who are in this situation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, as I said, I think families have experienced a situation like no other over the past year. Sorry, we're going into a year now. It's been difficult enough to have your loved one, a parent, a grandparent in long-term care, but then to be prevented from being able to visit has led, I think, to greater isolation, less of an opportunity for us to advocate for appropriate care. So, some practical suggestions I think I can offer is to really keep those lines of communication as open as possible with the facility. There's no harm in asking for updates, asking questions, trying to establish a relationship with a primary care person on the team, I think could be very, very helpful. And I know each facility is structured differently, but if there is somebody, that you're able to establish a connection with, that could go a long way. I think if something doesn't feel right, set up a phone call, contact management, talk to the leadership at the facility, and don't hesitate to seek clarity about the care of your family member. Just on the other side of things, I think as you're receiving responses to things, you should document the responses you're getting. Keep your own records, so that you're able to tell your own side of the story if something were to go, awry. I think if there are particular approaches to the care that have worked well for your loved one, you should share those thoughts and strategies with the healthcare team. I think keeping apprised of what's going on in the long-term care sector, as we know, it's so dynamic, lots of changes all the time, and you shouldn't hesitate to ask questions. And then, if you're not making your own headway with dealing with the facility itself, in Ontario, for example, there is a complaints line that can be accessed for urgent complaints, which include, harm, neglect, danger to residents. So, you'd have to make the assessment about whether that's the appropriate next step, but that is available as well.
That's good to know. I don't think many people know that there's a recourse beyond. But I just want to thank you for those really practical solutions, because I think that can give a little sense of control and power over a feeling that or a situation that feels otherwise, incredibly helpless. I'd like to change direction just a little bit, but you mentioned earlier about the responsibility of healthcare workers to report and be aware and stay on top of regulations, policies, procedures. I'm going to refer back once again to the podcast I did with Gary Will last year when we talked about the COVID-19 class actions. That was specifically about the Orchard Villa long-term care facility in Pickering, Ontario. And he identified that many of the issues that are being brought to light right now predate both the Wetloffer killings and the COVID-19 pandemics. And although I think that everyone acknowledges that these problems are systemic, and I think we also would acknowledge that systemic problems require systemic solutions, Gary's advice to individual care providers was that if they see a problem, that they act on it, they speak up, they report it to their supervisor, and as you just mentioned, if need be, report all the way to the Ministry of Long-Term Care or some facility that has oversight. Because now more than ever, residents of facilities cannot rely and don't have families to act on their behalf. Right. I mean, as we all know, you can't even be present in a long-term care facilities. And Gary highlighted, much as you did, the duty that care providers have to come forward and take protective measures when things aren't being looked after. This, of course, is perfectly sound advice, but we're going to talk about this just a little bit more today. But I want to start with some further comments by you on you as your nurse/lawyer designation, which is so valuable. Talk to us a little bit about the subject of healthcare providers' duty to report perceived wrongdoings in any setting, but let's get specific about the long-term care setting.
Well, sure, Chris. I absolutely agree with Gary. I agree that healthcare professionals do have an obligation. Specifically, and to add, I think, is regulated healthcare professionals are required to report, and they also have an elevated duty to practice in accordance with the standards that are established by their regulators. So they do need to keep this in mind when they're making decisions about what to do. So let me give you an example. I think in Ontario, there's a established code of conduct for nurses. This code of conduct explains to the public what behavior and conduct they can expect from a nurse when receiving care. And it really should inform the nurse's practice and what they're going to be professionally accountable to. So with the code of conduct, in Ontario, there's six principles. Nurses have to respect the dignity of their patients. They've got to work together to promote the well-being of their patients. They have to maintain trust by providing safe and competent care. They have to work respectfully with their colleagues to meet their patients' needs. They have to work with integrity to maintain patients' trust. And really, all of this will garner the public's confidence in the nursing profession. So I think as a nurse, as a regulated professional, when deciding to act on what to do, there's often relevant guidance right there within some of these standards and guidelines that exist. And I would suggest that regulated professionals look at these and take these into account when, trying to decide whether or not they should or should not be reporting.
Could you go back and just talk a little bit more? You said nurses have an elevated responsibility, elevated duty. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, as a regulated professional, as a regular, person in society, we all try and do the right thing. But I think when you're in a position of trust, as you are when you're working in the medical profession as a nurse, that you have this elevated responsibility to your clients to be able to advocate for them, to be able to know when something doesn't seem right, to ensure that they're receiving the appropriate care, to ask questions if care doesn't seem to be aligned with what they need. So there's all of those things that come with, a fulsome care plan, the therapeutic nurse-client relationship that you need to establish. And so that's what I mean that's what I meant when I was talking about this elevated accountability.
Thank you. I want to dig just a little bit deeper into that subject because even though I think there's nobody that would disagree that isn't just the best piece of advice ever, and the obligation and the responsibility exists, and it's the right thing to do. Certainly, I've had many conversations with nurses in my career, and most recently in another podcast, Dr. Daniel Ofri, who talked about medical error in the healthcare system, describes how the fear of a negative repercussion can paralyze care providers from speaking up, even when you see substandard care or dangerous care. And even though I think we all get that it's our moral right and perhaps obligation to disclose harm or potential harm, it can create a real moral and ethical storm in the person and in the workplace. The ideal goal, of course, would be a culture where that didn't exist and everybody felt free to say what they wanted to say. But that isn't currently, I wouldn't say currently, the reality of working in healthcare. What thoughts or advice do you have for healthcare professionals on facing that incredibly difficult task of speaking up when there is perhaps a very real threat of a negative repercussion?
Again, I think just to say, I think that as a regulated professional, there really is this higher standard that's expected. And so the ultimate goal should always be kept in mind. You need to provide safe and effective care to your patients. Who else is going to do that, right? That's what you're there for. So when this is being compromised, I think you sort of have to go back to that clear obligation that exists to raise a flag, to follow up, to try and implement change, to mitigate the risk that exists, to create a safer environment for your patients who really, they put their trust and faith into the system when they are this vulnerable. And many of them don't have a choice. So I think, as difficult as it is, I think we all go into this profession, not because we're forced, but because we do care about the patients who we look after, or care about, trying to improve the system so that the patients receive the right care. So I think is always just keeping that in mind, that clear obligation.
That's good. When I asked Dr. Ofri a little bit about that, she, her advice was to just pretend that person that you're standing up for is your family member. It's your mom, it's your sister, it's your daughter, it's your aunt, and to put yourself in the shoes of the family. And certainly in the medical legal work and teaching that I've done, there are multiple cases where the culture on the unit or the the hospital or the facility is that the nurses are afraid to speak up and they stand by and watch something happen. And, there's often a lot of support and sympathy for nurses. I'll poll a room full of nurses and they'll say, but it's really hard and it's really scary to speak up in that situation. But certainly from the medical legal perspective, when there's a very negative outcome, I say, no, what's really hard and really scary is living with the knowledge that your silence in that moment may have contributed in any way to the harm of the patient. And then, of course, living with the guilt and the negative emotions that haunt some nurses for life, or haunt some nurses to the point that it takes them out of nursing when they feel horrible for being any part of harm. So I don't know if anybody finds that helpful or not, because even though it is scary, the other side's not pretty either, to not speak up. Absolutely. But I've never talked to a nurse or a doctor, for that matter, who doesn't have an example of a time that they wish that they'd had the courage to speak up, regardless of the consequences.
Yeah. I do really recognize that these are, challenging situations. But I do, I think, keeping the client's safety and well-being in mind, if you know that it's being compromised, the other side of that is the difficulty living with knowing that and not doing anything, right? So it really is sometimes a really ethical dilemma that you're dealing with. But I do think nurses need to take action, especially when they're noticing something, or if, their colleagues are putting clients at risk or being abusive to their clients in any way, that they do speak up.
Of course. And I just want to acknowledge too, for everyone listening, because I know, we're presenting the ideal, but I want to be very cognizant of the reality, because certainly there's stories of whistleblowing, for lack of a better word, causing huge risky situations for nurses, results in being ostracized, criticized, sometimes humiliated, sometimes losing your job. And there's some very complex issues in there, but I appreciate what you said, but not speaking up or feeling repressed and unheard is its own significant moral outrage and problem too. So am I right to assume that your response to saying, even though it's really hard, and even though there might be some serious repercussions, and even though job loss might result, that the responsibility is the same?
I do think so. And I think, that's when you seek out support from your trusted advisors, your network, leaders that can help you work through some of those dilemmas. So as you mentioned, no two circumstances are going to be the same. You're going to have a unique set of facts that you have to work through, depending on where you're working. The structure might encourage or prevent, the escalation of issues. So it's really about looking at the context you're in, figuring out what you feel comfortable, what the right thing to do is in that circumstance, and then really talking it through potentially with individuals who might be able to support you in your decision making. So
good advice. It's not an easy job, this nursing healthcare stuff, is it? I remember seeing in a movie quite a few years ago. I think it was a movie called We Bought a Zoo, starring Matt Damon. And it wasn't a brilliant movie, but there was a line in there which I've never, ever forgotten. And it was something along the lines of, all it takes is 20 seconds of courage to change a life. And that's always stuck with me, because sometimes that job of speaking up feels completely overwhelming and frightening and scary. But you just think, I got to be brave for 20 seconds and then just stand back and feel the fallout from whatever's going to happen, which is not easy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not underestimating that, but I appreciate that. So, and I think as nurses, it's easy for us to, we have a job and we do our job, but I think it's sometimes in the course of that, we can forget that significant responsibility that we have, and we don't always have a full understanding of our legal obligations in some of these situations. We're just there to do our job. So thanks for that little reminder of our elevated responsibilities and our obligations. I think I want to go back to, you talked a little bit about the steps of if you see an issue, who you can talk to, who families can talk to, and it kind of ends up and culminates with reporting to the Ministry of Long-Term Care. But I fully understand that that's not the first step. Can we back up just a little bit and talk about the sequence of events that are recommended for care providers who witness or suspect unsafe care?
Yeah, so I think in general, regulated health professionals should bring their concerns forward to their leadership in their respective environments. There's probably some sort of approach that would work in the sector that you're in or in the facility that you're working in. And then, in addition, and for example, in Ontario, certain matters are reportable under the Long Term Care Act. So these matters would include things like improper and incompetent treatment, abuse, unlawful conduct, misappropriation of money or funding. So those kinds of really, egregious type issues. And I think that as a healthcare professional, the most important thing to keep in mind is your role in supporting your client's health and well-being. And this should be at the forefront when making a decision about what to report and when and to who.
I understand too that there is, in certain cases, they're not just like a professional and or moral obligation, but a legal duty to disclose information. There's legislation, as you mentioned, that requires healthcare providers to report things like child abuse or abuse of vulnerable adults. And there may be legal consequences for failure to report those things. I think this is something that healthcare providers are kind of vaguely aware of, but perhaps could use some clarity on. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And does the definition of vulnerable adults include residents of long-term care facilities?
Right. Well, in Ontario, there is an obligation to report. So members of regulated health professions, such as and social workers and naturopaths, must even report this information. If it otherwise seems confidential, they have a duty to report. And so, since the pandemic and greater awareness around long-term care, there's been a push for the federal government to work with provinces and territories to set out a national standard for long-term care and amendments to the criminal code in order to explicitly penalize those who neglect seniors under care. So, yes, I think residents of long-term care homes would definitely meet that criteria. And there is an obligation, like if you just think about how vulnerable this population is. And, at the outset, I sort of wanted to highlight what the resident composition is to give you a flavor for the types of issues these individuals are facing or what their health concerns are. They really don't have the ability to advocate for themselves. And then with this added layer of complexity with the pandemic, without having your loved ones at your side to be able to advocate on your behalf, it just makes it such a difficult situation to be in. So, I think there is some emphasis needed and some focus on how these issues can be uncovered and how these things can be surfaced if and when there is risk.
Good answer. I want to talk just for a second too about, I've talked to a lot of long-term care nurses across the country in the last few months and just checking in and seeing how they're doing. And, what you hear in the media is one thing, but, the frontline worker story is a whole another insight into what's really happening. And I've been both heartened, heartwarmed and surprised, and not in a negative way, but just a little bit surprised at the incredible loyalty that a lot of the nurses I've spoken to in particular have felt towards the employer. And when we talked about the issue of, they recognized the unsafe care and they recognized the problems, but their loyalty to the employer and their recognition that in some cases, the institution themselves, their managers, were doing the best that they could, that divided loyalty was really creating a conflict inside of them. On one side, the professional obligation to both provide safe care and report unsafe care. Yet on the other side, that incredible loyalty that they felt to their staff members, to their managers, and to the institutions that some of them had worked for 25 years. What are your thoughts on how care providers can sort out where those loyalties lie in a way that allows them to do the right thing? And I'm going to put right in quotation marks because the right thing, of course, is very subjective and very situational. But thoughts on that?
Well, nobody said healthcare is easy. It sounds like, just with this conversation that we're even having, how many ethical decisions need to be made. Again, I think there's lots of guidance in resource that exists through the regulators, through professional associations, probably through your own employer too, depending on where you work. And I understand that there are several difficulties that may be associated with bringing concerns forward. But this is why we have regulated professionals in these kinds of positions, because there is that guidance, there's that increased education and awareness of what's right and wrong in those situations. And so we do, as healthcare professionals, have an obligation to act in the best interests of our patients. Mm-hmm. And I think the efforts for client safety really rest with all of us, and we have a part to play in identifying that risk.
Yeah, good one. It's just a tough gig, isn't it?
Yes.
It's particularly tough right now, but nurses are among, if not the most trusted professionals on the planet. So right. I think I appreciate what you said in the context of never, of not losing that trust and honoring and feeling the weight of the responsibility of that in a way that allows us to provide that safe and competent care. Mm-hmm. So well said. Do you have any other comments about the subject that you'd like to make?
No, I think I, like everybody else, can't wait for this pandemic to be over, because it's going to come to an end. We'll probably be living in a different world at the end of this. Probably lots of silver linings that we still have yet to uncover, but, I think, be well, be safe, practice protocols, stay home,
Could you share with us one of your silver linings that's come out of this?
Well, I do have a little boy who's, been grown so much since last March. He's 5. Have my husband, who's transitioned and pivoted his own industry from, being out all the time and traveling quite a bit to doing work from home. I think my biggest silver lining is how much time we've been able to spend together as a family. Although there's been stressful moments, I think overall it's been so nice. And I know I'm going to miss that once we all sort of go back into what we used to do. It was really busy, not a lot of time for each other, a very active social calendar. I'm really liking the change of pace. So I think that's my biggest silver lining. Yeah.
That's a good one. So for those of you listening, we almost always do a second shorter podcast talking about the guests that we've had. But Farah and I did this last time we talked. We did an About Farah Ismail shorter podcast. So we're not going to do that again this time. But the last time we spoke, Farah, you were just launching into a transition with your professional role. Can you tell us what's happened since last time?
Sure, I'd love to share. I think I had shared last time that I started my own consulting practice called Intersect Consulting. So really a lot of the focus over the last few months has been keeping apprised of what's happening within the healthcare sector and how it connects back with the law, and then really how it applies to broader healthcare organizations. So we have a website up and running, and I have a blog that I've been writing some pieces on, which has really been the majority of the work I've been doing there. And I also have accepted a role with SE Health, known as St. Elizabeth Healthcare, which is a home care company, national in scope. They really deliver quality, trusted home care to people who need it. And I think, through the pandemic, it's become abundantly clear just how safe home care has been, a very safe space for the elderly. So I see, tons of opportunity there that if it wasn't evident before is really going to become evident now in terms of care for our aging population.
Well, thank you so much for the good work that you're doing in home care. And what is your website for Intersect?
Now you're going to keep me on the spot. Well, it's Intersect Consulting. And if you do a Google search, you will find it. maybe I could just pull it up. It's called Intersect Healthcare and the Law. So intersect-healthcareandlaw.com.
All right.
We also have, LinkedIn profile and Instagram page. So, encourage you to follow along and hear about issues impacting our system.
Nice. Well, good luck with everything. And once again, thank you. Thank you for the good work that you're doing. And a sincere thank you for being here with us again today. It's
An
been
absolute pleasure. Thank you.
it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, and take care.
You too.